Well, hey everybody. This is round 2 of the apologetics class. Does everybody know that this is my dad here, sitting beside me? He's the only person in the class that's not from our church, and so he thought he might feel kind of weird. But my dad is also into apologetics, so if you have any questions, you can just direct him to him. Yeah, that's right. So a couple years ago, my dad signed up for an account on Facebook. And it's always strange when your parents are on social media. And I can tell you for certain that the world has never been the same since. But one of the things that my dad wanted to do from signing up on Facebook was he wanted to kind of reconnect with some of the people that he had known in his past as a kid, as a teenager, things like that. And he did accomplish that goal with a few people. But there's one in particular that really sticks out. It's a guy who used to live here, now lives out of state. And, you know, you can never tell just from someone's Facebook profile or how they act on the internet. Like, you can never tell exactly how they are. But just judging by this guy's interactions on Facebook, he's probably the most profane and insulting, God-hating atheist that my dad has ever known. And he likes to post things on Facebook that just kind of pick on Christianity, pick on faith, etc.
And he grew up in a Christian home. My dad tells me. So the reason I bring this up is sometimes he'll post all these crazy things, and I really enjoy that because, you know, I like hearing about it from my dad and thinking about these arguments that are being put forward. But one of the things that he has said before is something to the effect of every time science makes a new discovery, Christianity becomes more irrelevant. And so if you think of the assumptions behind that claim, he obviously believes that Christianity and science are in this match to the death. They're diametrically opposed to each other. And because science is always going forward, then by default, Christianity must be going back. Now that probably sounds pretty good to his friends on Facebook, but there's actually two major problems with that kind of thinking. Number one, the vast majority of scientific discovery doesn't have anything to do with faith. I was recently reading a newsletter from a college up in Michigan, and they were talking about healthcare and the system and all this. And they pointed out that 95% of the medicine that's practiced today did not exist in 1950. Now, I don't think that when people come up with a new vaccine or they cure a disease or something like that, they don't just sit back and think, oh man, there's no God. I just cured this disease. Like that, there's no overlap there. It doesn't make any sense. Now, the second reason that is a kind of faulty way of thinking is, although there are certain scientific things that we need to deal with as Christians, I was listening to an interview with a philosopher of science recently named J.P. Moreland. He works out in California at Biola University. And he was being interviewed, and he said, you know, of the scientific discoveries that have any bearing on the faith, he would argue that actually the majority of the scientific discoveries actually make faith more rational. Now, that's not to say that there's nothing that we have to deal with, like I said, but you would definitely not hear that in our culture today. Like, people think that science and faith are against one another, like my dad's friend. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about science. And last time I taught this class, I had 3 people drop out halfway through. I have the sneaking suspicion that it's because of these 2 talks that we're going to go through, because they didn't like science or something. So if you don't like science, just hold on for another 3 weeks, and we'll get through it. And we probably won't talk about too much science after next week. But next week, we'll talk about the design of the universe, and we'll go through a bunch of maybe like tiny or small scientific discoveries that kind of give us a cumulative case that the universe was designed. Today we're going to talk about one major discovery and some little discoveries that kind of back it up. So tonight's argument is the first formal argument. It's known as the Cosmological Argument for the existence of God. You could also just say it's the argument from the beginning of the universe. And you can't talk about this for very long in apologetics without running into a guy named William Lane Craig. Now you should recognize that face, because he was in that video last week that we watched on pluralism. Does he look familiar? Okay. This is kind of like the guy when it comes to apologetics. Very well known, He's like probably the number one. He is a philosophy professor at Houston Baptist University and also teaches at Biola at their School of Theology. But the name, I can't think of the name. Talbot School of Theology. He's written over 30 books. He travels all over the world speaking. And a couple summers ago, my wife and I got to see him in Columbus. He presented a paper on the moral argument for the existence of God. About an 8-page paper. It was very stimulating. He's also known for his debates. I have no idea how many debates he's done. There's so many, you just can't even keep track. There are entire feeds on that website I gave you, apologetics315.com, that you can subscribe to that are just William Lane Craig debates. So you get on iTunes, you just download all these debates. And that's just a fraction of the debates that he's done. And in fact, if you're bored on a Friday night, you got 3 hours to burn, I would suggest watching his debate. That was supposed to be funny. I would suggest watching his debate with Christopher Hitchens at Biola. It's super long, but it's pretty cool because Christopher Hitchens is one of those 4 horsemen of the new atheist movement that we talked about last week. And so you've got like 2 of the top guys on the opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to the question of God. And Craig really takes him to task. Like you can literally just watch Christopher Hitchens sitting there sweating. One atheist in the crowd was interviewed afterwards. He said that Craig spanked Hitchens like a disobedient child. He was embarrassed. And there was one thing about this debate that I've never seen happen before or since, but Christopher Hitchens, one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheist movement, he had like 7 to 10 minutes at the end where he could have like said something else, and you just see him kind of lean over to the moderator. Then the moderator stands up and is like, Christopher Hitchens has yielded his time. We will now go to closing statements. It's pretty cool to watch. Now, obviously, you don't base truth on who wins the debate. But, you know, when you've got 2 guys like that, it's nice to see our side come out on top. And his website is reasonablefaith.org. He is kind of the granddaddy of this argument. He didn't make it up. He didn't come up with it like it's been around for over 1,000 years. But he kind of took what was there. He's researched it, tweaked it, put his own little spin on it, uses it in his debates. And he's probably the most knowledgeable person on this that we'll ever find. So now to the argument. This is the cosmological argument. Super simple. There are 2 premises, which are lines 1 and 2, and then the conclusion would naturally follow if those 2 things are true. So the first premise is whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. If you can memorize this, you can memorize the cosmological argument. Now, obviously, we're not done tonight. The heavy lifting is just looking into the premises and then seeing what you can draw from the conclusion. So the first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. And that word in there, begins, is very important. It's not that everything has a cause, but it's whatever begins to exist has a cause. And the reason for this should be pretty straightforward. Effects are always preceded by their causes. But if something is eternal, then it wasn't preceded by anything. Therefore, it would not need a cause. Is that making sense to everyone? This first premise is so obvious that if it's hard to prove this, it's because we assume that it's true already. We go about our daily lives assuming that whatever begins to exist has a cause. For example, if things can pop into existence uncaused, out of nothing, why don't we see this happen all the time? Why don't we see things like, and this could just be any random thing, why don't we see things like geothermal systems, or new kitchens, or Jeep transmissions, or anything else like that just come into existence? That would be nice if those things would just pop and here they are, but that's not how the world works. Our everyday experience tells us that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And William Lane Craig has a good illustration to show that everyone in this room already believes this premise. Because there's no one sitting here tonight that is worried that back home in your living room, a horse has just popped into existence, uncaused out of nothing, and is now defiling your carpet. It just doesn't happen. So for your atheist friends, you could also point out that science is based on the law of causality. You can't do science unless this is true.
Craig also points out that denying the first premise is worse than believing in magic, because at least in magic, when the magician pulls a rabbit out of his hat, you've got the magician, that would be the cause, and you've got the hat from where the rabbit came. There are people who say you can't actually even argue this point because it's so obvious you would have to use proofs that are less obvious than this premise. Everybody assumes that it's true, whether they admit it or not. So now what about the second premise? The universe had a beginning. Non-believers used to think that the universe did not need a cause because it had always existed. And like I said before, if anything's eternal, it doesn't need a cause. But until recently, that was the main view of this, and it's only been about 100 years that science has proven that the universe had a beginning. And you can't talk about this without talking about a subject known as the Big Bang. Now, those words have a lot of baggage. Those words mean different things to different people. But I'm going to argue tonight that the Big Bang, in its general assertions, is actually good for us. But a lot of Christians don't like the Big Bang. So maybe you can help me with this question. What are some reasons why you think that Christians don't like the Big Bang?
Probably because they assume that if scientists believe in it, it must not be Christian origins.
Okay, so maybe that's back to that idea of like science and faith are in conflict. So if the science is proposing it, then it must be against the faith.
Because the way it's normally taught, my experience is that God didn't create, that the Big Bang created.
Okay. So that...
It's the presentation more than anything, I suppose.
Yeah, that's common. I hear my students say that all the time. That is mixing up the effect with the cause. So they'll say, what caused the universe? Oh, the Big Bang caused the universe. But actually, the Big Bang is the effect. Big Bang doesn't cause anything. Something needed to cause the Big Bang or the beginning.
Yeah, it seems to go against intelligent design. It just happened.
Okay? So it's just kind of a brute fact.
It's like, when it's taught, even in some Christian circles, that God needed the Big Bang in order to create the world, but we know that he isn't dependent upon that.
Sure.
That he could have done it apart from that.
So it wasn't just God, it was God and the Big Bang.
Yeah.
Okay? Any other thoughts?
It's something to argue against and people don't like conflict.
Okay.
So like, yeah, that was pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah. Some people like conflict. I just like the idea of conflict. I don't really like engaging in conflict. I'm surprised no one brought up the age of the universe. That's a biggie. And if maybe you're not super familiar with this, there's a certain group of Christians within our faith, like their brothers and sisters, who believe that the universe is very, very old. And there are other brothers and sisters who believe that the universe is very, very young. Usually the Big Bang, when it's taught in the context of billions and billions of years. People who don't think that the universe is that old, they don't like that. So they attribute negative thoughts and feelings to the Big Bang. Now, to be clear, the majority of apologists, not all, but most, believe that the universe is in fact very old. Also, sometimes people link the Big Bang with evolution, but I would also say that the vast majority of apologists, most not all, would reject this kind of like grand scale, macro level Darwinian evolution where you start with a single-celled organism and then you get to human beings. So obviously you can believe one, not the other. Our church's position on the age of the universe is that it is quite young. Now, obviously, for this talk, because most of the resources out there teach an old universe, I used a lot of those sources. The authors of our book believe that the universe is old, and I made sure with Steve, I was like, hey, not everything in this book that's taught is in line with our church's doctrine. He said something that I thought was pretty cool. He said, well,
if we only read things that agreed with our beliefs 100%, we wouldn't do a lot of reading. And that's probably true with any subject. I mean, there's disagreements in science, obviously in politics, disagreements in history. And this disagreement on the age of the universe, we know for a fact that it goes back to at least the 5th century. So we're probably not going to come to a consensus anytime soon. Now, I did try to look at young Earth resources as well, just to see, the point is not the age. I want to make that very clear. The point is that it had a beginning. So I wanted to see, is there anything in this teaching that the old Earth people would disagree with, that the young Earth people would disagree with? And I use Jason Lyle as my young Earth source. In my opinion, he is the best and brightest that view has at the moment. And from what I gather, other than just talking about the Big Bang, every scientific evidence that I'll show, he agrees with. We'll talk about thermodynamics, we'll talk about the expanding universe, Einstein's theory of general relativity. All of those things are the things that everybody agrees on. The Standard Model says that the universe came into existence a finite time ago out of nothing. Now, Christians have believed in what's called creation ex nihilo, which means creation out of nothing. So isn't it interesting? You got the Bible saying something, you have science saying something. I think that the young Earth guys are too picky with this, because my approach is, what do my unbelieving friends already agree with me on that I can use against them? Because I'm such a nice guy. So most people agree that the universe had a beginning, that it came out of nothing. Nothing is actually a very hard concept to wrap your head around, because we don't use that word the way that we should. For example, when your children open the refrigerator and there's just vegetables inside, if you say, hey, what's in there to eat? They will probably say, nothing. But that's not what we mean by nothing when we talk about the beginning of the universe. We mean matter, space, and time all came into existence at a single point. It's very hard to think about, very hard to talk about. And what our science teachers did not tell us when they taught us the Big Bang is that scientists at the time, the non-believing scientists, hated the idea, and the believing scientists thought it was pretty cool. Here's an example. Arthur Eddington was not a Christian. He was an astronomer, a physicist, and a mathematician. When people started talking about the universe having a beginning, he said, philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant to me. I should like to find a genuine loophole. In another place, he said, the beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look on it as, frankly, supernatural. So these scientists back then, they knew that having a beginning to the universe was going to have certain implications. Unfortunately, today, the universe having a beginning, that's just taken for granted. Nobody actually stops to think about the implications of that. Later, a man by the name of Robert Jastrow wrote a book called God and the Astronomers. This is not just some guy off the street. This guy took over the chair of Edwin Hubble, who has the telescope named after him. He worked for NASA, and he founded his own space institute. In his book, God and the Astronomers, Jastrow said, the idea of a universe that comes into being abruptly is distasteful to the scientific mind. Later in the book, he says, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Now, what's he mean by that? Scientists were so excited to make all these discoveries. In a different place in the book, he says, we've painted ourselves into a corner. We've come up with a scientific theory that we don't like. And not only that, but it fits very well with a theistic view of the world. Even Einstein himself did not like the idea of a beginning. He was doing equations, and he saw that his equations were pointing towards a beginning. He disliked it so much that he introduced a fudge factor. He let his own bias get in the way. I don't know how he did this, but the book says he divided by 0. This is in Geisler and Turek's book. Later, 2 other scientists independently proved that the universe had a beginning, and Einstein said it was the biggest blunder of his career. So this is an idea that the unbelieving scientists did not enjoy when it was first proposed. So the book gives us 5 lines of scientific evidence so that we can know that the universe had a beginning. They use the acronym SURGE so that we will remember it. The S in SURGE stands for the second law of thermodynamics. The U stands for the universe is expanding. The R stands for radiation from the Big Bang. The G is for great galaxy seeds. And then finally, the E stands for Einstein's theory of general relativity. I see many of you taking notes. This is in the book. Now, for the sake of time, and for the fact that I know more about 3 of these than all 5, we're not going to do SURGE. We're going to go through SU. So what does the S stand for? Second law of thermodynamics. What does that mean? The first law of thermodynamics says that in a closed system, matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it can change states. And in our universe, which is a closed system, the second law says that we have a finite amount of usable energy, and it's not being destroyed, but it's being used up. So if the universe were left to itself, we would get to a point where we would reach equilibrium, and it would be a universe with no light, no heat, just cold and dead. Now, obviously, as Christians, we know that God's not going to allow it to get that far, and it's not going to happen for a really long time, so don't lay awake at night worrying about that. I've also heard it said that the second law of thermodynamics can be thought of as order moving to disorder. And I saw an interview with Jim Gates from MIT, and he was talking about the Big Bang once, and he said the Big Bang is a highly ordered state. It is probably the most ordered event in all of physics, and so everything that came after has been an increase in disorder. I don't know what to make of that, but that seems interesting, don't you think? The most ordered thing in physics was the beginning. So why does this point to the beginning? If we have a finite amount of energy and it's constantly being used up, the universe could not be infinitely old because we would have run out of energy an infinitely long time ago. The U is for the universe is expanding. Wherever astronomers point their telescopes, they see that the galaxies are moving away from us. And not only that, but the galaxies that are farthest away are moving away the fastest. So it's not that everything is expanding, but space is expanding. And the universe isn't expanding into empty space, it's the space itself. One way to think of this is to imagine a deflated balloon with buttons glued on it. If you were to inflate the balloon, the buttons would stay in the same spot where they were glued, but they would get further and further apart. So the idea is, if we rewind the clock and we go backwards, all of the galaxies, instead of going away from each other, would actually be coming closer and closer. You would get to a point in time where all the matter in the universe was touching, and you could rewind the clock back even further. The entire universe would be a single point, and if you were to go beyond that point any further back, you would have nothing. No matter, no space, no time. That is the beginning of the universe. While I was studying for this, I heard something I'd never heard before. Sometimes people say, "Where did the universe begin?" And someone replied, "The universe began everywhere." Again, I don't know what to do with that, but seems interesting. Finally, the E, Einstein's theory of general relativity. This theory has been verified to a high degree. It's made many successful predictions. The theory needs a beginning. Now, maybe you're sitting there and you're thinking, I'm not really into science. Or maybe you just hate the Big Bang, you don't even want to say those words. You're in luck. Because you can actually prove the beginning of the universe using philosophy and logic. And this was done centuries ago. To me, this is a little bit more abstract, a little bit harder to wrap my head around. So as long as there are no questions, we should be okay. So briefly, this one is actually in the book. I have 2 examples. This one's in the book. Can anyone tell me, is it possible to count to infinity? I see you shaking your heads no. That is correct. You cannot count to infinity because you could always go one more. And you could go one more after that. That's what's known as a potential infinity or a potential infinite. You're going towards infinity, but you never get there. You cannot count to infinity. But if the universe is infinite, how many days were there before today? All of them. That's a good answer, but a number.
Infinity minus one.
What's that?
It said infinity minus one.
Close. There were infinity days before today. So that would make today day number infinity. But you can't count to infinity. So the reasoning goes, if there were an infinite number of days before today, today would never have arrived. That's all I got to say about that. This one's a little better. This is the argument that you can't have an actually infinite number of actual things. Now, I don't know if there's anyone in here who's really into math, but there's actually different versions of what infinity is. Like there are a couple different kinds of infinity in math, and they each use a different letter. So if you see that little X-looking letter, that's the letter that I wanted to use. That is the Hebrew letter Aleph. But as you can see at the bottom, those are lazy eights, which are what people usually think of when they think of infinity. I kept them lazy eights because that's more common. And plus, I don't know if it's the fact that Hebrew reads from right to left, but when I started typing Hebrew letters into my PowerPoint, my MacBook went crazy. Like, it didn't know what to do. And I think that's because there are two sets of letters going opposite directions, and it just would have been terrible to try to put Alephs in there. So, but anyway, in this example, imagine that you have an empty bag, and you have an actually infinite number of blue marbles. You can't put one in the bag one at a time, but if you could scoop them all up, you could put them in the bag, and you would have an equation like this. 0 marbles in the bag plus an infinite number of marbles equals an infinite number. But then let's say your friend Dave comes over and he says, I've got an infinite number of red marbles and I don't want them anymore. Can you take them off my hands? You say, yes, put them in this bag. Then you could write it like this. Your actually infinite number of blue marbles plus the actually infinite number of red marbles equals an actually infinite number of marbles. But you don't have any marbles than you had when you started. Isn't that strange? But it gets worse. Let's say you don't like your red marbles, so you take them out. An actually infinite number of red marbles were taken out. You should have half, but infinity minus infinity still only equals infinity. But then you think, well, those red marbles aren't too bad. I'll put 3 in there. So in this example, infinity plus 3 equals infinity. But then you think, I want to take all the blue marbles out. Infinity minus infinity equals 3. Now that should strike you as odd, because in each one of those examples, it made decent sense, but when you put all those together, you get contradictions. You get nonsense. Now that might seem pretty far out, but the reason I bring this up is Christians proved that the universe had a beginning by using things like this over 1,000 years ago. They didn't use marbles, but I've seen this done with hotel rooms. I've seen this done with planetary rotations. So like if you've got a sun, a moon, and a planet, and the moon goes around 12 times, and the planet goes around once every year, well, if they're infinitely old, even though the moon has gone around 12 times more, they've actually both only gone around an infinite number of times. So you get these weird contradictions. As I mentioned last week, the reason we are doing this class is because I want you guys to be $1 apologists. You just need to take in some of this information and be able to give it back to maybe your kids or even your believing friends, strengthen their faith. Or if you have friends that are atheists, maybe you can convince them. And I hope that some of you in here are thinking, yeah, that would be pretty cool to tell my friends about this argument. But you're probably also thinking, how in the world would I memorize all of this information? The good news is you don't have to, because I can almost guarantee that every person that you know already believes in the first two premises. They already believe that the universe began to exist. I've never met anybody who believed otherwise. And so, if you think about it, if you were hanging out with an atheist friend and they said something really kooky one night, like, the reason I can't believe in God is because there's no evidence. Now, I know that everyone in this room knows that there's evidence for God, but people say things like that all the time. But if your friend said that and you turned to them and said, hey, friend, do you believe that the universe had a beginning? If they say yes, then you can just forget about everything I've said in the past 20 minutes. It's that easy. You might need to convince them that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but again, that's just showing them that they already know that to be true. I would also say you could remind them that science is looking for causes. Whenever you bring science into it, that's really convincing for a lot of people. I can also guarantee you that they've never thought about the conclusion and the implications of the conclusion. So is there anything that we can know about the cause of the universe? I can tell you that the cause of the universe needs to be very unimaginably powerful. Can anyone tell me why that would be so?
It's huge.
What's that?
It's huge.
What's huge?
Universe.
The universe is huge. It's really heavy, too. And so something had to be strong enough to cause the universe and then fling it all out in all different directions. The cause also needed to be immaterial, meaning it cannot be made of matter. Does anyone know why that would be? What do you think?
Because there was nothing before that.
Very good. There was nothing, and that includes matter. Matter comes into existence at the beginning. You could say the same thing for the next one. It has to be outside of space, also known as spaceless. It has to be outside of time, also known as timeless, or even eternal. Gasp. It has to be those things for the same reasons, because space and time come into existence at the beginning. The cause also needs to be personal. And this one is the one that I have the most trouble with. I have trouble seeing why the cause can't be impersonal. The idea behind this is the only things that meet the second, third, and fourth bullet are immaterial objects like numbers or a disembodied mind. Numbers can't cause anything, so you would need a disembodied mind to choose to create. Now that makes sense to me. I think that's the weakest one myself, but maybe that's just my weakness because I'm having trouble wrapping my head around it. If this were the only argument for the existence of God, I would say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. He needs to be personal. I think that what we will talk about next week is actually a better argument for the personality of the cause. And I'll give you a little sneak peek here because I have a quote that pertains to what we've been talking about today and what we will talk about next week. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with Stephen Hawking. He's the guy that Homer Simpson once lovingly referred to as the wheelchair guy. But he was probably one of the most brilliant scientists of our time. Not a Christian. Probably his most famous work is the book A Brief History of Time. It was a New York Times bestseller. It's also been called the least read bestseller of all time because it is about physics. But I was struck by this quote: if the rate of the universe's expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have collapsed into a fireball. Now think about that for a second. 1 second after the beginning, there were things in place that had us in mind. Now what does that even mean? 100,000 million. You take 100,000, you times it by a million, you times that by a million, and you will get a 1 followed by 17 zeros. Now what does that mean? This is a number that is so big we cannot wrap our heads around it. But I came up with a really great illustration. Let's just call this number X. And let's say you need X amount of money. And you come to me and you say, hey, Chris, you're a teacher. I know you got a lot of money. Can you loan me X amount of money? And I say, 1 with 17 zeros? That is a lot of money, but I do have that. If I were to loan you that amount of money, I would say, here's the stipulation. You need to pay me back $1 every second until your debt is repaid. That would actually be a really great deal for you because to pay back X, $1 a second, it would take you 3,186,800 years and some change. and I'd be gone by then, so I would never get my money back. This is a giant number, the number of seconds in 3.168 billion years. What Stephen Hawking is saying is the expansion rate of the universe was a certain speed. And if you were to take that speed, divide it by this number into all those little pieces, you take one of those little pieces out, you don't get a universe, you get a giant fireball and nothing but death. You don't even get death because life hadn't existed, I guess. Any questions so far? Here's some common objections. It doesn't matter how well you explain this argument to somebody, they will always say, "Who made God?" Now, this is actually a logical fallacy, but you got to be able to pick up on some certain subtleties here. Let me rephrase it. If everything needs a cause, then who made God? That's what that means. Can anyone tell me why that doesn't work?
Because he didn't have a beginning.
Because he didn't have a beginning. And that's not even the argument, right? Because if you don't have a beginning, you're eternal, you don't need a cause. This is something that you really need to watch out for. This happens in apologetics, in politics, all the time. This is what's known as a straw man argument. It's easier to fight a straw man than it is to fight a real man. If someone takes your position, remember how I said last week the best thing you can do to know apologetics, or to answer people's questions when it comes to apologetics, is to know your Bible? Because a lot of times when people start to critique the Bible, they show that they don't have any clue what the Bible actually says. That's kind of like a straw man argument. The first question you should ask is this actually what I believe? Like when someone comes against what you're saying, you need to ask, is this what I believe? The argument is not that everything needs a cause. If something is eternal, it had no cause. We should remind people, this is what atheists used to believe. Even in the early 1900s. Even up through the 50s and 60s, people were saying, well, the universe doesn't need a cause because it's always been. Now that that's not convenient, people forget. Other things people usually say against this, they usually will say, something caused the universe and it is X, Y, and Z. I've heard people use gravity, spinning particles, vibrating membranes, and the quantum vacuum. The problem with every single one of these is these are not nothing. And how does gravity even work if you don't have a universe? It doesn't make any sense. Sometimes people say this is the God of the gaps. The God of the gaps fallacy is whenever we don't know anything, we just stick God in there. And the idea is, well, later science is going to come along and they're going to come up with an explanation. You're going to look foolish. But this is not God of the gaps. We're not saying that we don't know what caused the beginning. We're saying that we know all of these different attributes of the beginning, and that really describes the God of the Bible. It's also interesting to notice that Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, when he was asked what caused the universe, he said, we're working on it. Now that's interesting because it shows the amount of faith that he has in his religion, science. But the problem is science will never find out what the cause of the universe is. You can't prove that scientifically. And to go back to our old friend Jastrow, he said, the religious faith of scientists is violated by the discovery that the world had a beginning under conditions in which the known laws of physics are not valid, and as a product of forces or circumstances we cannot discover. A sound explanation may exist for the explosive birth of the universe, but if it does, science cannot find out what that explanation is. Science is only concerned with things that are inside the universe. Now, we believe that there's a physical realm and a spiritual realm, but we don't believe you can go put the spiritual realm in a test tube because it's outside of science. You need to find those truths out in a way that is not scientific. Sometimes people say, well, what about other theories that don't have a beginning? The Big Bang Theory, the Standard Model, was attacked when it was first proposed. And they came up with theory after theory after theory trying to knock this thing down. The book talks about those theories. The two major problems that I've seen is either the theory has no testable evidence, like there was a theory that said we can have an eternal universe, but we've got to have stuff coming into being like forever, and we don't see that. The other problem was that it didn't get rid of the beginning, it just pushed it back one more step. And if you're trying to get rid of the beginning, if you just push it back a step, what's the point? It's also interesting to see how those theories, quote-unquote, fail when they realize that they're actually not getting rid of the beginning, then they just chuck the whole thing. This is actually a pretty good one. This doesn't get you to Christianity. And I believe this is absolutely true. But you shouldn't ask what it doesn't get you. You should ask what it does get you. If this argument is true, it eliminates all non-theistic beliefs. To prepare for this, I got on YouTube and I watched some of those videos that are like, Cosmological Argument debunked in less than a minute, or why the cosmological argument is stupid. And I was kind of struck by some of their arguments. They think that if you believe in the cosmological argument, then you need to believe in like Zeus or Krishna or Ganesh, Vishnu. What they don't realize is this argument only fits with one view. Think about the atheistic view. For those of you that weren't here last week, most, if not all, religions can be boiled down into atheism, pantheism, or theism. That's where we're going with this. If you're a consistent atheist, who created everything? The answer has to be nothing, or you'll never know. Those are the only two answers. Western Michigan University philosophy professor Quentin Smith wrote a book with William Lane Craig, and he said the universe came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. So he's saying, yeah, you can look for causes inside the universe, but the whole show, that doesn't need a cause. It just came out of nothing. Came from nothing. Think about this. Let's say your teenager brought your car home and it looked like this. You said, hey, what caused this state of affairs? And your teenager said, it was nothing. You would not accept that as a good excuse. If you would not accept that for something as trivial as an automobile accident, you should not accept it for something as grand as the origin of the universe. I don't know why that slide is in there. What about the pantheistic view? If the universe is God, then it had to create itself out of nothing. But saying that something can create itself is logically incoherent because effects are always preceded by their causes. And if you say that something caused itself, you're assuming that it already existed. The Dalai Lama, I guess he's like really into science, and he wrote in a book that modern cosmology does not fit with a Buddhist worldview, but it fits very well with a theist worldview. Now, the Dalai Lama is holding out hope that maybe we just don't know everything, and someday we'll find something that will say, hey, this actually works better with Buddhism. What about theistic religions? If God is powerful, eternal, immaterial, and spaceless, like the Bible says, then who created the universe? Well, that's easy. It was God. This is really nice, because there's probably between 4,000 and 5,000 religions in the world, and we've just boiled it down to one major view, theism. And of theism, there's only 3 major competitors: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And as we go, some of these other arguments will knock down other theistic views like deism, Zoroastrianism, etc. To finish, I have a short movie. It's basically everything we talked about in about 4.5 minutes.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin? or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, prove that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
Pretty good video. Yeah.
One thing they said there, they said that the universe can't cause itself, like they showed a picture of the box.
Mhm.
Isn't that what they say? Like, isn't that what they say? Is that the universe did cause itself?
That, I do not think that is the idea, because that doesn't make any sense. How can something cause itself?
Well, I didn't say I believe in the Big Bang.
I know, but I mean, there's kind of like a logical contradiction there. I think that that's just kind of one of those misconceptions, maybe, because, like I said, the Big Bang is the effect. I just say beginning. I don't even bother using the terminology Big Bang. But the idea is nothing can cause itself. Like, you can't give birth to yourself. The universe can't come into being by itself. So, like, the theory is just like getting back to the beginning, like what was that like? But once you get to the beginning, you can't see past that. Okay? The one thing about that video, I wish they would go into the personality a little bit more. It seems kind of abrupt. They're just like God. But pretty decent video. Pretty good. Obviously, this is not a slam dunk. You don't get to Jesus by believing this argument. You could give this argument to your friend, and they might say, okay, God exists, but I'm not going to believe in the God of the Bible. But I think that this is really good for a number of reasons. I mean, if I was an atheist, it's sometimes hard to think from someone else's point of view, but if I were an atheist, like, this would keep me up at night. Like, what caused everything? Like, where did all this come from? Or if I was a pantheist, it can't cause itself. But as a Christian, I sleep comfortably in my own bed all night long.
Are there any questions?
In the video, it talked about a single point. You said that there was someone or some group that believed that the universe could have been created from numerous points. But if it was created from numerous points, then it would seem like that you would be able to measure from Earth some things getting closer to you.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense if it's from one point that everything is going away from each other, then anything you measure is going to be going away from you.
Yeah.
So how do they come to the conclusion that it even could be multiple points?
Well, when you say multiple points, are you thinking of when I said the universe began everywhere?
Yeah.
Because I think the idea behind that is the universe was so small and then it flew apart. And all of that flying apart is the universe.
So that spot was everywhere at the time.
Yes.
Okay.
Like, it's so hard to think about because when we think of, like, taking the universe and shrinking it down to a point, we're, like, looking from the outside. But if we were to actually do that, like, we would actually be in that point. Be very uncomfortable. As far as resources, did everybody find everything okay online? Okay, very good. I'll put that video on that we just watched. That's a good one. I just watched that over and over and over again, and then it starts to sink in after a while.
And you can get to that by Craig's website, right? Pretty simple.
Yeah, but there will be a link. Like, it takes some finding on the website. If you just go to YouTube and type in Cosmological Argument, Craig, it'll come up. And he's got a bunch of videos. They're really short. They're really nice. So we're going to watch a lot of them. And I saw some new ones that I'd never seen before until yesterday or the day before. So if you'd like to see William Lane Craig give a kind of explanation for this in a teaching setting, this video is really nice because it's only 10 minutes long. Not even that. But you get the information from the source. And you just kind of get to see, like, okay, what would it be like to sit in one of his classes? Something a little bit longer, but on the popular level, Frank Turek, the author of our book, he does a little talk. It's about 50 minutes to an hour. But it's nice because he doesn't go into a ton of detail. I will say, though, this video is really weird. There is about a 2-minute section where I don't know if they lost the audio or they lost the video or what, but they took a talk from a different place and a different time, but it was the same talk, and they spliced it in there. But the coloring is different, the venue is different, and the volume jumps like 3 times louder. Over the summer, we did a little apologetics study with some of the people in our church, like the Daltons. And it was kind of fun to show them this video and just kind of sit back and wait for that part, and everybody jumped because they didn't know it was coming. So you can trick your friends, I guess.
This is why they're called the Kalam. What's that?
So the cosmological argument is actually a family of arguments. And to my knowledge, it's not that they disprove one another. It's just like if you want to focus on a certain aspect, there are different arguments that focus on a different part. And so the history of this argument is we think that Christians came up with it. And then when North Africa was conquered by the Muslims picked it up, and Christians just kind of like left it. And then it went full circle, and then Christians picked it up again, like centuries later. And then William Lane Craig got it. And I guess Kalam in Arabic means word or doctrine, maybe? Something like that. So he wanted to like keep the feel of it. But it's just like his version of the argument is called the Kalam. And that's the version that you usually see because he's so popular with it. So. Something to listen to, although I found out today you could also watch it because it's on YouTube. But last year, J. Werner Wallace, our guy from last week, he did a talk in Columbus, and it's on the beginning. This is the guy that's the homicide detective, the cold case homicide detective. So he goes through, like from a detective's point of view, and looks at the cosmology. A very nice, popular level teaching. And if you like visuals, you should watch YouTube because he has a really nice slideshow. Here's that interview I mentioned with J.P. Moreland. He doesn't really talk about the beginning, but science, culture, faith, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. Something to read. Here's the article I gave you. It's from J. Werner Wallace's website. One of the things about J. Werner Wallace, he's more of a popularizer, but after he retired from the police force, he was so into apologetics that he would just write something every single day. He would record something every single day. So his website is just huge. There's tons of information in there. So he's going to be coming up a lot. If you would like something a little deeper, here is a 22-page article by William Lane Craig. It's not super deep, but he definitely goes into a little bit more of the science. Any questions?